Hi, I'm Bennett McNulty from the University of Minnesota, Twin Cities. Today I'll be presenting my talk, The Unity of Reason and Its Varieties, Systematicity in Chemistry, Psychology, and Natural History. So there's a classic image of Kant as philosopher of science that predominates, even among non-specialists. And this picture especially emphasizes the a priori grounding of natural science in the metaphysical system of the first critique. Now, this conception can be characterized as presenting a sort of top-down conception of scientific rationality. That is, according to this conception of scientific rationality, we begin with the a priori categories of the understanding and derive from them a priori laws of natural science. Now, among these a priori laws for Kant are analogs to the Newtonian laws of nature. So, for example, an analog to the law of inertia and that of action and reaction. But ultimately, the basis for these a priori laws in natural science is the understanding, and in particular, its categories. Now, Michael Friedman is a kind of defender of this, or an interpreter that espouses this conception of Kant as philosopher of science. Thus, Friedman writes the following. In answering these questions, namely, how are synthetic a priori judgments possible and how is pure mathematics possible, Kant develops what he calls a transcendental philosophical theory of our human cognitive faculties in terms of forms of sensible intuition and pure concepts or categories of rational thought. These cognitive structures are taken to describe a fixed and absolutely universal rationality, common to all human beings and at all times and in all places, and thereby to explain the sense in which mathematical natural science, the mathematical physics of Newton, represents a model or exemplar of such rationality. This is the classic image of Kant on scientific rationality, according to which the model of scientific rationality proceeds from the top down, via determination from the categories of the understanding. However, this classic image is somewhat blinkered, namely it's derived from a particular source, namely Kant's views on properly so-called natural science, that is, physics. This singular properly so-called natural science is the main topic of Kant's Metaphysical Foundations of Natural Science, in which he deduces the a priori laws of rational physics from the categories of the understanding. So he makes good on this model of scientific rationality. However, if we consider the improperly so-called natural sciences, as Kant describes them in the preface to the Metaphysical Foundations, we can develop an alternative conception of Kant as philosopher of science and an alternative conception of his views on scientific rationality. These improperly so-called natural sciences, unlike physics, lack a priori laws. There's a number of these improperly so-called natural sciences, but in this talk I really want to focus on chemistry, psychology, and natural history, and how consideration of these three improper natural sciences gives us a new image of Kant as philosopher of science. Now, what do I mean by an inverted image of Kant as philosopher of science? I mean that according to this approach, or according to these sources for Kant's conception of science, we get a bottom-up account of scientific rationality. That is, consideration of the improper natural sciences reveals that Kant made room in his philosophy of science for substantive inferences from experience. And indeed, this is an essential part of how these improper natural sciences function. But here's the most interesting bit, in my view. He thinks that this inference from experience is deeply intertwined with the faculty of reason. That is, it can even presuppose ideas of reason, ideas of things that go beyond the possibility of experience. Moreover, when we examine Kant's account of the function of reason in the improper natural sciences, it problematizes the received view of the function of reason in science. So here's the standard view of the way that reason functions in science for Kant. First, it aims at logical systematicity. That is, reason aims at organizing the concepts of science in a genus-species hierarchy and the judgments in inferential relations. And also that the ideas of reason and the idea of systematicity describe a mere regulative goal to inquiry. That is, the ideas describe this endpoint for inquiry, which we can asymptotically approach, but never actually achieve. But attention to the bottom-up sort of reasoning that Kant depicts in the improper natural sciences upsets this received view. In particular, I want to show that reason helps us achieve a non-logical unification of empirical observations, and moreover, ideas of reason are integrated and essential parts of inquiry. They're not just endpoints to which we're aiming, but are rather coming up in our day-to-day practices in these improper natural sciences, according to Kant. So in particular, I'm going to focus on the ideas of the elements in chemistry, the soul in psychology, and nature's intentions or purposes in natural history, and the way in which they give us this new conception of Kant as philosopher of science, and a new conception of the role of reason within science. So first, I will chat about chemistry, then psychology, then at the end, natural history. So first, chemistry, elements, and experiments. The main focus of this part of my talk is going to be the elements, which are ideas of reason for Kant that organize chemical observations, and in particular, they bring a causal unity to observations that we make in chemistry. Now, Kant discusses the elements in a few places, but most prominently in student notes from his lectures on physics and in the appendix to the dialectic of the first critique. So the following quote comes from the appendix to the dialectic. Here Kant writes as follows: "Such concepts of reason are not created by nature. Rather, we question nature according to these ideas, and we take our cognition to be defective as long as it is not adequate to them. Admittedly, it is hard to find pure earth, pure water, pure air, etc. Nevertheless, concepts of them are required, though as far as their complete purity is concerned, have their origin only in reason, in order appropriately to determine the share that each of these natural causes has in appearance. Thus, one reduces all materials to earths, mere weight as it were, to salts and combustibles as force, and finally to water and air as vehicles, machines as it were, by means of which the aforementioned operate, in order to explain the chemical effects of materials in accordance with the idea of a mechanism." So I first want to focus on the back half of this quote and the way in which the elements provide a sort of non-logical unification to chemical phenomena. That is, the way in which they comprise the causal grounds for chemical occurrences. And that's really disclosed by this part of the passage where Kant says we use these elements to determine the share that each of them as natural causes has in appearance. Now for Kant, there are 5 elements, though he sometimes tweaks it a little bit, tweaks his list of elements a bit. There's earth, salt, fire or phlogiston, water, and air. Now, the first thing I want to point out, which the passage from the appendix to the dialectic demonstrates, is that these elements are causal grounds for observed phenomena. So, for example, salt explains acidic phenomena, phlogiston explains inflammability phenomena, and so forth. We unify chemical phenomena by explaining them in terms of these elements as causal grounds. Moreover, these elements are ideas of reason for Kant, meaning that they're beyond the possibility of experience. These elements are just postulates that we use to explain the phenomena that we witness. They're hypothesized as pure bearers of properties to provide the ultimate explanations and unification for chemical phenomena. Now, it might seem strange to say that water is an idea. After all, we come into water every day. But it's crucial to note that for Kant, the water that we come into contact each day isn't elemental water. The elements are pure bearers of properties and are understood just as playing a distinctive functional role. So elemental water is only the bearer of the property of being the vehicle for salt, that is, the vehicle for acidity. And this pure bearer of a property isn't something that one actually comes into contact with in experience. So again, these elements are just ideas of reason. They're postulated as pure causal powers, and they're used to bring a causal unification to our empirical observations. But additionally, as Kant emphasizes in the quote that we looked at a moment ago, we also question nature according to these ideas, in particular these ideas of the elements. So this raises the question of how do we question nature according to ideas of the elements, and in what way do these ideas function in the practice of chemistry? Now, the answer to this is partially revealed by a famous passage on the so-called secure path of science in the second edition preface to the first critique. This passage uses really similar language about questioning nature and demanding answers from nature. In the passage, Kant also highlights the innovation of an important chemist from his time period, namely Georg Stahl, who spearheaded and invented the phlogistic theory of chemistry. Thus Kant writes as follows: Stahl changed metals into calx and then changed the latter back into metal by first removing something and then putting it back again. Reason, in order to be taught by nature, must approach nature with its principles in one hand, according to which alone the agreement among appearances can count as laws, and in the other hand, the experiments thought out in accordance with these principles. Yet in order to be instructed by nature, not like a pupil who has recited to him whatever the teacher wants to say, but like an appointed judge who compels witnesses to answer the questions he puts to them. So for Kant, Stahl is one of the paradigm investigators of nature that interrogated it by taking principles to experience, by questioning nature according to principles. And indeed, Stahl did this with an idea of reason in the one hand, namely that of phlogiston, and consideration of the experiment that Kant is here alluding to helps clarify the way in which we question nature according to reason's ideas, and the way in which these ideas play an essential role in inquiry. So Stahl himself noted that there was a certain analogy between two chemical processes, those of calcination and combustion. In calcination, one takes an inorganic material, particularly a metal, roasts it, and ends up with what is called a calx. And a calx is an ash-like substance that will have distinct chemical properties from the metal that it was derived from. So here we have lead being turned into lead calx. Combustion is an analogous procedure where one takes an organic material like wood or charcoal, burns it, and ends up with ash. Stahl, like many that preceded him, noted that these processes look really similar. So there's a question as to whether or not they are unified. They can be understood as the same kind of process. To answer this question, as Kant sees it, Stahl's innovation was to take our principles to experience, namely, to take the principle of phlogiston to experience. So as Stahl understood it, phlogiston is the principle of combustion. It explains what happens to the wood when you burn it. There's phlogiston in the wood, which means that it's burnable, and when you combust the wood, off comes the phlogiston, floats away. So, can we use phlogiston to explain both of these processes? Here is the experiment that Stahl cooked up in order to determine whether these are analogous processes. So first he took a piece of metallic lead, calcined it to produce lead calx. Then he mixed that calx with charcoal, an organic material, and burned the charcoal. Now, as Stahl understood it, when you combust an organic material like charcoal, that releases the phlogiston from it. However, in his experiment, he found that when he burned the charcoal alongside the calx, the metallic lead revivified. So the calx turned back into its metallic counterpart. This experiment shows then that whatever was lost from the metallic lead during calcination is replaced by the charcoal as it undergoes combustion. So that means that in both processes, combustion and calcination, phlogiston is being taken away from the reagent. Thus, they are both dephlogistication processes. Thus, through this experiment and through taking his principle to experience, Stahl demonstrated that calcination and combustion were both phlogistic processes. So this is the way in which, as Kant put it, Stahl changed metals into calx and then changed the latter back into metal by first removing something and then putting it back again. The something there is phlogiston, and the experiment depends upon taking this idea of reason to experience and interrogating nature with it. So, to conclude the part of this talk on chemistry, this example really shows, and also some of the passages from the appendix to the dialectic, show the way in which ideas of the elements provide a non-logical or causal unification to empirical chemical phenomena. And they also play an important role in the process of inquiry in chemistry. Right? We're experimenting on the elements, as it were. Next, psychology and the idea of the soul. So in this case, instead of elements, I'm going to focus on the idea of the soul as the important idea in the context of the improper natural science of psychology. The idea of the soul is somewhat different from those of the elements, though, and also the practice of psychology is different from that of chemistry for Kant. So there's a different model here for how the idea functions in psychology than in chemistry. In psychology, one of the important distinctions is that we cannot conduct experiments according to Kant. The basic idea here is that we lack the requisite control over our inner representations in order to set up and conduct experiments. So there's going to be something a little bit different happening here in psychology than what is happening in chemistry. There is, however, a natural description of the soul, an improper natural science, even if we can't do experiments. So let's talk about the idea of reason that is involved in this science of psychology and its role in unifying disparate inner phenomena. So later in the appendix to the Transcendental Dialectic, Kant discusses the function of the idea of the soul in psychology, writing the following. Following the ideas named above as principles, that is the transcendental ideas, we will first in psychology connect all appearances, actions, and receptivity of the mind to the guiding thread of inner experience as if the mind were a simple substance that, at least in this life, persists in existence with personal identity while its states, to which the states of the body belong only as external conditions, are continuously changing. That means it is not a simple thinking substance that we derive it is not from a simple thinking substance that we derive the inner appearances of the soul, but from one another in accordance with the idea of a simple being. So the crucial idea here is that we need to act as if, or assume that, the mind is a simple substance when we are doing psychology. And we imagine that all of the phenomena of psychology, the inner appearances that we are concerned with, are determinations or attributes of this simple mental substance. And it's this postulation of an idea that makes possible a non-logical unification of the empirical observations of inner sense. The idea of the soul really codifies the kind of similarity that we have of inner experiences and our inner powers or faculties as well. All of these things are conceived of as attributes of an underlying mental substance. So this provides a sort of non-logical or substantial unity to empirical observations. But that the idea is merely regulative doesn't mean that it's just an endpoint to which we aspire. Rather, this idea of the soul plays a substantive role in inquiry. Now, to be clear, it doesn't play as substantive a role in psychological inquiry as the elements played in chemistry, right? We're not experimenting with the soul. Nonetheless, it does do some important work. So this methodological work that the idea of the soul does for psychology is disclosed by this passage from a little bit later in the appendix to the Transcendental Dialectic. So here Kant writes as follows: "Now nothing but advantage can arise from such a psychological idea, if only one guards against letting it hold as something more than a mere idea, i.e., if one lets it hold merely relative to the systematic use of reason in respect of the appearances of our soul. For then empirical laws of corporeal appearances, which are of an entirely different species, will not be mixed up in the explanation of what belongs merely to inner sense. Then no windy hypotheses about generation, destruction, or palingenesis of souls, etc. will be admitted. A consideration of this object of inner sense as a whole will therefore be instituted, and this will not be mixed up with the properties of any different kind. Moreover, the investigation of reason will be directed toward carrying through the grounds of explanation in this subject as far as possible on the basis of a single principle. All of this is best effected through such a schema, just as if it were an actual being. Indeed, it can be effected only and solely in this way." I think this is a really fascinating passage for getting clear on the way in which the idea of the soul functions in psychology. This idea is methodologically fruitful and crucial for narrowing the domain of inquiry and critically narrowing the domain of explanation in psychology merely to inner sense, so that we don't get things mixed up with the laws of bodies. That is, the idea of the soul as a simple substance limits the domain of explanation and rules out materialistic hypotheses. And Kant is very clear in this passage that what's crucial is that we're using this idea of the soul as a substance. Indeed, he says at the very end of the passage that this restriction of explanation in psychology can be effected only and solely in this way, by using an idea of the soul as a simple substance. And then through this idea of the soul, a natural description of the soul is possible. The idea of the soul brings the unity to observations, particularly of faculties, and we don't get inference to universality or laws like we do in physics or chemistry, but nonetheless we can develop a fruitful doctrine of the soul. And this doctrine of the soul can furthermore be a source of data for pragmatic anthropology. So again, the point here is that the idea of the soul does these two plays these two roles with respect to the improper natural science of psychology. It provides a non-logical, that is, substantial unity to empirical observations, and also it plays an important methodological role in inquiry in psychology. Finally, a science for the gods, natural history, and the ends of nature. So in this part of the talk, I'm going to be explaining the way in which nature's intentions play an important role with respect to natural history and making possible this improper natural science. I'm especially going to focus on Kant's account of race and the way in which it makes use of nature's intentions. Now, I want to begin with a disclaimer, one that I think is particularly important in our present context. And that disclaimer is that Kant's racism and his scientific racism are abhorrent, and we can't just pass over his scientific racism without comment. Kant arguably invented the scientific concept of race. He espouses a racial hierarchy throughout his career, and the penetration of his racist thought into the critical philosophy and the moral philosophy is a matter of some contention. Moreover, historically, race science like Kant's have played critical roles in justifying the horrors of colonialism, eugenics, and genocide. Kant's contribution to scientific racism cannot simply be ignored. I'm going to be making some points about his conception of natural science based on the theory of race, but I can't just ignore it without comment, and I think that we as Kant scholars need to do some serious soul-searching and reflection on Kant's role in the formation of modern racism and how that infects or influences his broader philosophy. So with that said, in the first race essay, Kant sets out his goal as transforming the system of classification that is used in natural description or with respect to natural history. That is, Kant in particular wants to replace the quote-unquote school system of classification, which Linnaeus used, with the natural system of classification that was spearheaded by Buffon. The school system classifies organisms together based on shared characteristics or similarities. That's what Linnaeus was doing. But Kant opts instead for the natural system, which organizes organisms together under species insofar as they have a unity of generation or share a phylum. So two organisms for Kant or for Buffon belong to the same species not because they share general characteristics, but because they share a generative history. We can see Kant making this point in the following quote. The school division concerns classes, which divide animals according to resemblances. The natural division concerns phyla, which divide animals according to relationships in terms of generation. The former provides a school system for memory, the latter provides a natural system for the understanding. The first only aims at bringing creatures under titles, the second aims at bringing them under laws. Then Kant has a particular rule for determining when two individuals belong to the same species, that is, they share a generative history, and that is the so-called Buffon's rule. According to Buffon's rule, individuals that produce fertile offspring are of the same species. So Buffon's rule is what gives unity to a generation or to a phylum. And this is the basis then for the unity of the human species despite racial diversity. So as Kant argues, individuals of different races still have fertile offspring, so they are of the same species. So this justifies Kant's account of monogenesis of humanity. Now, despite the argument for monogenesis, there's nevertheless hereditary variation in humanity in the form of races, according to Kant. For Kant, races are hereditary subspecies. That is, racial characteristics are passed down invariably through generations. This raises the question of why there is subspecies variation. To account for this, Kant appeals to teleology. We can see his use of teleology in the following passage from the first race essay. Kant writes, "Chance or the universal mechanical laws could not produce such agreements, i.e. between species and their environment. Therefore, we must consider such occasional unfolding as preformed. The human being was destined for all climates and for every soil. Consequently, various germs and natural predispositions had to lie ready in him to be on occasion either unfolded or restrained, so that he would become suited to his place in the world, and over the course of the generations would appear to be, as it were, native to and made for that place. With these concepts, let us go through the whole human species on the wide earth and adduce purposive causes for its subspecies therein, and cases where the natural causes are not easily recognizable, and again adduce natural causes where we do not perceive ends." So in this quote, Kant is explaining that racial variation can be explained by purposes of nature. Nature's purpose was for humanity to be universally distributed across the world. And for that purpose, nature gave humanity the possibility of diversifying into different races. So nature's purposes bring another level of unity to human diversity by explaining why there are different races. So this brings a sort of non-logical, that is, generative unity to humanity despite the diversity of races. However, in the mid-1780s, German naturalist Georg Forster objected to Kant's account of the races, which spurred Kant to further specify the relationship between hypothetical accounts of nature's intentions on one hand and empirical data on the other. So Forster famously claimed that natural history in this sense, in Kant's sense, might, however, possibly be only a science for gods and not for human beings. His complaint is that since we could not have witnessed the generation of species, Kant's science of natural history, based on insight into that generation, is impossible for us humans. Now, Kant's 1788 paper on teleological principles and parts of the third critique are direct responses to this skepticism. In these sources, Kant develops a complex but reasoned interplay between the unknowable intentions of reason and empirical information. So let's look at some of the aspects of this account which reveal the way in which these ideas of reason, ideas of nature's intentions, play an important role in inquiry in natural history. So first, Kant notes that our attributions of purposes to nature needs to be sensitive to empirical evidence. Thus, Kant writes that the use of the teleological principle with respect to nature is always empirically conditioned. Not only does he give an abstract statement of this, also Kant gives us a little bit more meat on this bare statement. Kant even defends a kind of uniformitarianism, I would say, in the teleological principles essay. That is, Kant argues that we need to connect the present condition of species to their generative causes in the deep past of the world, according to, quote, laws of efficient causality which we do not make up, but derive from the powers of nature as it presents itself to us now. Right? What Kant is saying there is that you can't make postulates about the deep history of the world and the human species that appeal to powers that we've never seen before, but rather you can only make appeal to powers that we see today. That's a pretty resounding statement, I think, of a kind of Kantian uniformitarianism that denies that the past world was substantially different from the present world. So that's a way in which our explanations of those generative causes need to be restricted in a way by empirical evidence. But not only must the use of teleology abide by empirical evidence, but furthermore, the teleology, the speculative hypotheses into nature's purposes, is methodologically important and informs our observations of the world. And Kant makes that clear in this quote from the essay on teleological principles, but there's also some similar passages in the third critique. So Kant writes, "The human species could be divided in a system of natural history into phylum, races or subspecies, and different human sorts. Yet all of that is so far merely an idea of the way in which the greatest degree of manifoldness in the generation can be united by reason with the greatest unity of phyletic origin. Whether there really is such an affinity in the human species must be decided through the observations that make known the unity of the phyletic origin. And there one sees clearly that one must be guided by a determinate principle in order to observe, i.e., to pay attention to that which could indicate a phyletic origin, not just the resemblances of characters, since in that case we are dealing with a problem of natural history, not of the description of nature and of mere methodical nomenclature." I think I really enjoyed this passage. I think that there's some definite shades of the take our principles to experience sentiment that is expressed in the second edition preface to the first critique. In this passage, Kant is explaining that this system for the unity of humanity or of species guides inquiry. It tells us what sort of things to look for that would disclose or give more evidence for the unity of the species and the unity of the generic origins of the species. In the passage from the third critique that I have referenced on the slide, Kant also describes using comparative anatomy to determine if certain individuals have a common generative history. So that's another case where our desire to unify and our system for unification are guiding and integrated with empirical inquiry into the world. So that's the way in which nature's intentions or purposes, I think, both play a role in providing a non-logical unification of empirical observations. They allow us to bring together those empirical observations as having the same generative source. And also these ideas of nature's purposes play an integrated and essential role in the inquiry and in the accumulation of evidence in natural history. So finally, to conclude, I just want to highlight again the main points. The main points are that when we consider Kant's views on the improper natural sciences altogether, it motivates a new conception of Kant on scientific rationality, one that proceeds from the bottom up, from empirical observations to scientific knowledge, and that conception is governed by reason. Moreover, these ideas of reason play or disclose new roles in natural philosophy for Kant. These ideas are providing a non-logical unification to empirical observations, and they are integrated and essential parts of scientific inquiry, which I think really provides a new and innovative account of the way that reason functions in natural science. All right, thanks everyone. Again, that was my talk, The Unity of Reason and Its Varieties, Systematicity in Chemistry, Psychology, and Natural History. Thanks for listening.